"She is so cute, Daddy." The giant bride was laughed off until the cowboy's daughter called her. Witness this unbelievable true-inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. It was a warm Texas afternoon, the kind where the sky stretched endlessly blue, dotted with the occasional wisp of cloud that drifted lazily above the wide open plains. The smell of freshly cut hay and the faint sweetness of wildflowers filled the air. In a small town on the outskirts of Lubbock, excitement buzzed through the community. The big barn by the river had been decorated with strings of lights, mason jars filled with daisies, and rustic wooden benches to prepare for a wedding. Folks from every corner of the county had shown up, some out of genuine love for the couple, others out of curiosity, and a few simply because small-town weddings were an event you didn't miss. The bride, Martha, stood nervously at the back of the barn, her white gown brushing against the worn wooden floor. Her aunt had spent months sewing the dress, carefully measuring and adjusting to fit her unusual height. At 6 feet 9 inches, Martha was a towering figure, the kind of woman who had drawn stares her whole life. As a child, she was always head and shoulders taller than her classmates. By the time she was a teenager, she looked like a grown woman among girls. People whispered about her, sometimes cruelly, sometimes in awe. It was something she had carried like a shadow, her size always speaking before she did. But today, she wanted to be just a bride. She wanted to be a woman in love, about to marry the man who had seen past her height, her awkwardness, and her insecurities. Robert, the groom, was a cowboy through and through. He worked the ranches, wore boots that were always dusty, and carried the calm, steady air of someone who lived close to the land. He wasn't tall, 5 feet 8, lean and strong from years of labor, but he was the first man who had ever looked at Martha and seen her heart instead of her height. They had met when Martha delivered groceries to his ranch one summer afternoon. What started as casual conversations on his porch had slowly bloomed into love. He didn't care about her size. He cared about her laughter, her gentle nature, and the way she treated his little daughter like family. Now, standing in her gown, Martha's heart beat with both excitement and fear. She could hear the murmur of the crowd outside, people settling into benches, the fiddler warming up for the music. She wanted so badly for this to be a day remembered for joy, but deep down, she knew her height would once again make her the subject of whispers, and she wasn't wrong. When Martha stepped into view, the chatter in the barn rose into a hum of surprise. Heads turned, eyes widened, and some mouths even dropped open. Children pointed, some giggling behind their hands. A few adults didn't bother hiding their reactions. "She looks like a giant," one woman muttered, her words sharp enough to cut. "Poor Robert," another man chuckled. "Looks like he's marrying someone who could wrestle him to the ground." "She doesn't even look like a bride," a young girl whispered to her friend, giggling. "She looks like some kind of scarecrow in a dress." The laughter spread in little ripples through the crowd, not loud enough to be an uproar, but just enough to sting. Martha felt every glance, every smirk, every whispered remark pierce her like tiny needles. Her cheeks burned under the heat of their stares. She tried to hold her head high, to focus on Robert waiting at the altar, but the sting of humiliation pressed against her chest like a weight. Her mind screamed with doubts. Maybe she was foolish to think she could have a day like this. Maybe she didn't deserve to be a bride, to stand in front of everyone in white, hoping to look beautiful. She thought of all the times she had walked through town and felt like a spectacle, an oddity no one forgot. Now, on the most important day of her life, it seemed the past had followed her again. Her eyes blurred as she tried to force a smile. She wanted to cry, to run, to hide behind the barn doors and never come back out. And then, just when the laughter seemed to echo the loudest in her mind, a voice rang out, small but clear. "Daddy, she is so cute." The barn fell silent, as if the words themselves had stopped the music of whispers. Everyone turned to see where the voice had come from. It was Emily, Robert's 7-year-old daughter, sitting in the front row with her boots swinging above the floor. With her freckles, bright eyes, and innocent smile, she looked at Martha with a kind of wonder that no adult had shown. "She looks like a princess. Daddy, the prettiest I've ever seen." The words hit Martha like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Her lips trembled, her breath caught in her chest. She looked at Emily, at the honesty shining in her young eyes, and something inside her shifted. For the first time that day, she wasn't seeing herself through the cruel lens of others. She was seeing herself through the innocent heart of a child who believed she was beautiful. Robert bent down, kissed his daughter's cheek, and whispered, "You're right, sweetheart. She's the prettiest bride in Texas." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The laughter that had once bubbled so easily now felt heavy with guilt. The sting of a child's honesty often had a way of exposing the cruelty of adults. No one dared chuckle again. No one whispered. Instead, they watched quietly as Martha, with tears glistening in her eyes, walked slowly toward the man who loved her and the little girl who had just given her the gift of courage. The fiddler began to play softly again, and the barn, once buzzing with cruel amusement, grew warm with silence. People who had come expecting gossip found themselves moved by the simple purity of a child's words. Martha straightened her back, her gown flowing with each step, and for the first time that day she felt not like a giant to be mocked, but like a bride to be cherished. And as she walked, she whispered to herself almost as a promise, "I am beautiful. I am loved. I belong here." It was the beginning of a story no one in that small Texas town would forget, not because the bride was tall, but because a little girl reminded everyone what true beauty really meant. The barn was hushed, the only sound coming from the fiddler's bow as it glided across the strings with a slow, tender tune. Robert reached out his hand as Martha finally arrived at the altar. His hand looked small against hers, yet it was steady, warm, and certain. When he squeezed her fingers, Martha felt the laughter of moments earlier fade away, replaced by the strength of his love and the innocence of his daughter's words. For years, she had feared being judged, mocked, or rejected. But now she stood in front of a crowd that had been silenced by a child's truth. Robert looked into her eyes and smiled in a way that only a man who truly understood could. "You're everything I prayed for," he whispered just loud enough for her to hear. The words filled Martha's heart with courage, and though her eyes still shimmered with tears, her lips curved into a soft smile. The preacher cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His voice carried through the barn, steady and familiar, like an old hymn that everyone knew by heart. As the vows were read, Martha barely heard the words. She was lost in the weight of the moment, the faces watching her, the little girl beaming at her from the front row, the man whose hand she held as though it were an anchor in a storm. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger. "I've spent my whole life standing out when I wanted nothing more than to fit in," she said softly, her eyes locked on Robert. "But you made me realize I don't need to fit in to be loved. You see me as I am, and for that I promise to spend every day loving you back with all that I have." There was no laughter now, no whispers, only silence broken by the sound of Emily clapping her little hands and saying, "Yay, Daddy! Hey, Martha!" The crowd chuckled nervously, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was warm, genuine, as though the little girl had given them all permission to stop pretending and start feeling something real. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Robert leaned in and kissed Martha, his hat brushing lightly against her forehead. The barn erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the rafters. Martha felt her body relax, the tension she had carried for hours melting away. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Not free from her height or from the way the world saw her, but free from the fear that love wasn't meant for someone like her. As the music picked up, people rose from their seats and began to mingle, shake hands, and head toward the long tables lined with homemade pies, cornbread, and barbecued brisket. Children ran outside, chasing each other across the grass, their laughter rising into the golden evening sky. The barn doors opened wide, letting in the glow of sunset, painting the celebration in shades of orange and pink. Martha stood beside Robert, greeting guests as they approached. Some of the very people who had mocked her earlier now shook her hand and told her she looked beautiful. Their words were awkward, almost forced, but Martha accepted them with grace. She had no room in her heart for bitterness tonight. She knew their change of heart had nothing to do with her gown or her figure, but everything to do with the child who had seen what they could not. Emily darted between the tables, pulling Martha by the hand. "Come dance with me," she said, her voice full of excitement. At first, Martha hesitated. She had always avoided dancing in crowds, afraid of towering over everyone and drawing attention to herself. But Robert gave her a nod, his smile encouraging, and Emily tugged again, refusing to let go. So Martha followed her onto the dance floor. The fiddler switched to a lively tune, and Emily twirled, her little boots kicking up dust as she giggled. "See, Daddy?" she called out. "She dances like a princess too." The crowd chuckled again, but this time the laughter was filled with joy, not mockery. Martha's face glowed as she spun gently, her dress flowing around her. She was taller than anyone else there, but instead of shame she felt pride. Pride in being herself, pride in the love that had brought her here, and pride in the little girl who had taught her to see herself through new eyes. As the night wore on, the stars came out one by one, scattering across the sky like diamonds. The barn glowed with lanterns, the hum of conversation and laughter filling the air. Robert's friends clapped him on the back, telling him he'd found himself a rare woman. Martha's relatives, who had worried she might never find love, wiped away tears as they watched her move through the crowd with confidence. For once, people weren't whispering about her height. They were talking about her happiness. When the time came for the first official dance as husband and wife, Robert took Martha's hand again. The fiddler slowed the music, and the couple swayed together under the string lights. Martha looked down at Robert, and though he was smaller in stature, his presence filled the space beside her. She rested her hand on his shoulder, her heart beating steady and strong. "I still can't believe this is real," she whispered. "It's real," Robert said, his eyes shining. "And it's forever." Emily clapped her hands, then darted between them, wrapping her arms around their legs. "We're a family now," she said with a grin. Robert laughed, picking her up and holding her between them. Martha leaned in, resting her forehead against both of theirs. It was an image no one in that barn would ever forget. The giant bride, her cowboy husband, and the little girl who had changed everything with a few simple words. As the celebration stretched late into the night, Martha found herself standing outside the barn for a moment of quiet. She looked up at the Texas stars, her gown glowing softly in the moonlight. All her life, she had felt out of place, like she was too much for the world around her. But tonight, she realized something powerful. She wasn't too much, she was exactly enough. Her size, her difference, her presence, it had all led her to this moment. To a man who loved her without hesitation. To a little girl who saw beauty where others saw something to laugh at. To a community that slowly but surely was learning to see her as more than a spectacle. Robert came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how one little voice can change everything," she answered, her eyes still on the stars. Robert kissed her cheek. "Emily's got a gift. She sees the truth people forget to see," Martha smiled. "She gave me more than I could ever ask for. She gave me the courage to believe I'm beautiful." Inside, the music swelled again, and people called for them to come back. Martha took Robert's hand and walked with him, each step lighter than the last. For once, she wasn't worried about being the tallest person in the room. She wasn't worried about whispers or stares. She was walking as a bride, a wife, and a mother, and the town that had once laughed at her was now cheering for her. That night, as they drove away in an old pickup truck decorated with ribbons and tin cans, Martha looked out the window at the barn glowing in the distance. She knew people would still talk about her height, still remember her as the giant bride, but now the title no longer felt like a wound. It was a badge of strength. Because when the laughter had threatened to break her, a child's voice had lifted her higher. Years later, people in town would still tell the story, but they didn't tell it as a tale of a bride who was too tall. They told it as a story of love, innocence, and redemption, a story where a little girl reminded everyone what true beauty looks like. And to this day, whenever Martha thought back to that moment, she could still hear Emily's sweet voice saying, "She is so cute. Daddy, she looks like a princess." And with that, the memory always filled her heart with light, a reminder that even in the face of cruelty, love and truth could transform everything.